www.usarepresentative.org.
Washington Journal continues.
Our next guest is Representative Jerrold Nadler, the Democrat from New York. He serves on the Judiciary Committee and other committees. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
The USA Freedom Act, is that something you support?
Absolutely. I was one of the authors of it.
And tell us a little bit about what it does to the current Patriot Act.
Well, it makes a number of modifications in the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act, Section 215 of the Patriot Act, for example, which I opposed initially 15 years ago, authorizes the collection of information that is, quote, of any tangible things, including information, metadata, that are relevant to a terrorism investigation or foreign intelligence investigation. We thought 15 years ago that was too loose. There should be more suspicion or reasonable suspicion, probable cause. But relevant was what was put in the law. The FISA court, the administration, both Bush and Obama, have totally misinterpreted that. And they've said that, well, all telephone calls are relevant. All internet traffic is relevant because within that there might be something you want to see. So they've gotten general warrants. You can look at all phone calls for the next 6 months. They've done that every 6 months. That's dragnet surveillance, bulk surveillance, which is completely unauthorized, beyond what we thought we were doing when we passed the bill. And we have to stop that. So what the USA Freedom Act does is it stops the bulk surveillance. It says you cannot get any metadata, that is, all the information about the phone call other than the actual content of the phone call or the internet, without some individualized suspicion, without describing who you're looking at with a specific selected term, which doesn't have to be an individual, but has to be narrow enough so it narrows the field. It can't be an entire zip code or Washington, D.C. It's got to be very specific, fairly specific, and you have to describe it and get the warrant. That is the key. You've got to get the warrant for individual calls, which is what the Fourth Amendment mandates. The Fourth Amendment was written because the United States, the Americans were opposed to the British general warrants or writs of assistance in the 1760s. Fourth Amendment was written, and this goes right back to the general warrants. So it stops that. It does a lot of other things, but that's them. It also, the FISA court is a secret court. The government goes in for a warrant in a secret situation. There's nobody to oppose it. The government goes in to make an argument. There's no one to oppose it. Court hears one side of an argument, such as everything is subject to one warrant, and issues a decision which remains secret. And so it issues an outrageous decision that you can have general surveillance under the bill, which is completely contrary to the law. No challenge. This bill does is amici, people in court, security clear people whose sole purpose is to argue against the government in the secret court hearing. And it also says, so the court hears both sides, and it also says that when the court issues any novel or significant opinion, that's got to be public. So had that law been in effect, when this outrageous interpretation by the court years ago had taken place, first of all, it might not have taken place because there would have been someone to argue against in court, but the moment it had been done, it would have been public. There would have been outrage that didn't come until Mr. Snowden revealed what was going on, and the Congress might have acted immediately.
Now it's in the Senate, and there are those who are resisting to making changes in the Senate. The chief of those is the Senate Majority Leader, who appeared earlier this week on the Sunday shows talking about it. Want to tell you a little bit about his concerns and get your response to it.
Well, actually, the bill that passed the House does not require the telephone companies to keep the records. I fear the House-passed bill will basically end the program, and I want to reassure everybody there are plenty of safeguards in this program. Nobody at the NSA is routinely listening into your telephone conversations. In order to intercept any actual discussion on a telephone, they have to go to a court, get a court order. This has been a very important part of our effort to defend the homeland since 9/11. We know that the terrorists overseas are trying to recruit people in our country to commit atrocities in our country. We saw a great example of just what I'm talking about in the Boston Marathon massacre. I don't want us to go dark, in effect, and I'm afraid that the House-passed bill will basically be the end of the program, and we'll not be able to have yet another tool that we need to combat this terrorist threat from overseas.
Representative Nadler, he says it's the end of the program if the USA Freedom Act is passed.
It's the end of the program if the USA Freedom Act is not passed, because Section 215 and various other provisions of the Patriot Act will expire June 1st, and I would rather they expire than continue as they are. And I think most members of the House feel that way. We got 338 votes out of 433 in the House for this bill, and this bill will be adopted by the Senate or the program will go dark. And frankly, it's more important. I don't believe that the program as run now is vital to our national security. No one has been able to show that these Dragnet surveillances have had any positive effect on our national security. The senator mentioned the Boston Marathon bombing had nothing to do with this. This program, which was in effect, didn't prevent it and couldn't, had nothing to do with it. Yes, there are always threats, but we have to balance liberty and security. I think the USA Freedom Act balances it well. And for the senator to say that there are safeguards in the existing law, there aren't. And that's why this outrageous interpretation by a secret court was taken and went on for years. We wouldn't know about it. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals said it was last week that it was a gross misinterpretation of the law. It's probably unconstitutional, but we wouldn't know about it if Mr. Snowden hadn't done us a public service by revealing it.
Our guest with us to talk about issues of the Patriot Act and surveillance and other issues, 202-748-8000, our line for Democrats, 202-748-8000, our line for Republicans, and 202-748-8002 for independents. The senator spelled out that phone calls actually weren't being listened in on. The decision or the concerns have always been the actual metadata. It's just those numbers. You can get,
but if you know every phone call that I make, who I make it to, who I receive it from, how often I make it, when I make it, and how long the phone conversations are, you can learn a hell of a lot violating people's privacy. Did I call a shrink? Do I call a shrink often? Do I call some woman who's not my wife all the time? Do I call someone involved in certain kinds of businesses, maybe business I'm not involved in, or competitors or something? You can learn a lot that most people would consider violate privacy without listening on the actual conversation.
Has there ever been an instance where somebody at the NSA or whoever runs this program uses that information the way you described inappropriately?
No, that's not I didn't say he'd use it inappropriately. I said it's inappropriate to have that information. Has anyone used it inappropriately in the sense of specifically done? I don't know. It's a secret program. We can't know.
First call, Jason. Jason is from Colorado Springs, Colorado. You're on with our guest. Go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to make a few comments on the national debt and the taxes being raised. One is the government officials should not make more than minimum wage, since the government is telling the American people that minimum wage is acceptable. I mean,
well, wait a minute. The government is not telling the people that minimum wage is acceptable. What Democrats at least are saying is that the minimum wage is too low and ought to be raised. Doesn't mean it's acceptable. You want to have policies that have people earning as high wages as possible, but you ought to set a floor on it, and that floor ought to be reasonable.
Again, our topic looking at the Patriot Act, Greeley, Kansas. Tim, hello.
Hi, how are you today?
Fine, thanks. Go ahead.
Representative Nadler, I appreciate you being on the show today, and I appreciate C-SPAN. I've been on several times. Basically, I just want to cover when George Bush came into office, the FISA law was intact, and basically the pundits come out and said, well, the president needs to authorize these wiretaps. He can't wait. He doesn't have the authority. He needs the authority, and we need this to be passed, these laws to be changed. But my understanding was from when Senator Feingold was on C-SPAN, I watched him, and he explained originally the FISA Act said the president could wiretap anybody he wanted to without any notification, but within 72 hours, they had to go in front of a FISA court judge to have it authorized. And the Bush administration didn't think that was enough time, and then Congress basically amended it to propose a 15-day period where they were able to literally wiretap without FISA court approval, but that wasn't sufficient either. And then that's when they changed this to where basically they went out and gathered, when they went out and basically wiretapped everybody. And then also my understanding was, since it's the FISA court's secret, so few of these have ever been denied. Like the FISA court's only denied like 2 or 3 requests from the government to actually intervene and gather this type of data. And then secondly, as far as the Patriot Act is concerned, I'd like to talk about the National Security Letter Program, which former FBI Director Mueller testified in front of a House subcommittee, that nearly 30% of these national security letters had absolutely nothing to do with terrorism.
Okay. Well, the caller will put that out there, so we'll let our guest respond.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many questions there were in that question, but let me talk first about the national security letters. There's been tremendous abuse. There has been, in my opinion, tremendous abuse of the national security letter program. I sponsored legislation and amendments years ago to greatly rein it in. One of the things that the USA Freedom Act does is to rein in some of the abuses of the national security letter, the NSL program. For example, when you get a national security letter, the FBI can issue them without a court and doesn't use a court. The FBI issues a national security letter. Let's say you're Google or somebody in the national security letter says, tell us what all the activity of so-and-so. You can't reveal that you've gotten that. There's a gag order. So one of the things we do in this bill is to change that law to say that under most circumstances, you can go to court, you can reveal, you can oppose the gag order so that people know about it, so you can tell the party really at interest, the person whose information they want. Yes, there are a lot of problems with the Patriot Act. I opposed the Patriot Act at the time that the USA Freedom Act does not deal with, but it does deal with some of the worst ones.
From Florissant, Missouri, Democrats line, Arnetta, hello.
Yeah. Yes, what I was calling about is the collection of the metadata. The way I understand it is that the NSA is collecting telephone numbers, dates, and times. There is no other information there. And a telephone call can come from anywhere. Because my granddaughter lives in Texas, but she still got the same area code on her phone when she was living in Missouri. So you don't really know where the call is coming in from. Well, and basically I thought that if someone they had targeted, they wanted to find out if they were connected with America, they would then come to NSA and ask them to run a query, and then they would have to go and get an authorization to further follow that number.
I'm not sure I understand the question. But as I said before, metadata, that is all the information about a telephone call other than the content, can be very invasive of people's legitimate privacy, and that collection has to be restricted. Under the existing program, you get one warrant to Verizon or to AT&T, and that warrant says, give us all the phone calls made in the United States on your system for the next 6 months. And then you just keep repeating that. The FISA court gives a blanket reauthorization. And you don't need any suspicion, because how is that relevant to an investigation which the law demands? Well, presumably within the universe of all phone calls is relevant information. Now, that's a ridiculous interpretation. What we do is say you can't get that warrant. You can't get that warrant for the metadata unless you can point to some specific individual or small group of people or small or building or something, and show the court some reasonable suspicion to believe that information in particular is relevant. And that's the kind of privacy protection that minimally you want.
What demands does the Freedom Act make upon telephone companies?
Well, they as a matter of course, keep the information. They've always kept it at least 18 months to 2 years. It doesn't demand that they keep it a number of years, but that has not been a problem. No one raised that as a problem.
Mason, Ohio. Tom, good morning to you. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm asking the question for Mr. Nadler, why Mr. Gowdy can't use the FISA court to investigate Hillary's emails that are stored. What is the big question here?
Well, the FISA court has a limited, forgetting the question of the investigation and what all the motives and things are there, but the FISA court has a limited jurisdiction established by the FISA Act, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978. It's supposed to deal only with questions of surveillance when you can't publicly go into a regular court because and ask for the warrant or ask for the subpoena because of national security. You don't want the Russian spies to know that you're looking at them, et cetera. Mr. Gowdy's investigation of Hillary, or anybody's investigation, is public knowledge. And if he's got good legal grounds for getting a warrant or a subpoena, then he ought to go to court and say those grounds, and the court makes a decision. There's no reason to use a secret court. You want to have the secret courts have as little as possible to do, because inherently it's a compromise against due process. You don't want secret courts. We only have it because it is felt that in the world of espionage and anti-terrorism, not everything can be public.
Clarkston, Washington. Milton, good morning. Republican line, go ahead.
Hello?
You're on, go ahead.
Yeah. Hello?
Milton, you're on. Go ahead with your comment or question, please.
Mr. Democrat Nadler, hello. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning.
Sir, you know I'm calling from the Republican line.
Fine.
And I respect you people with all my heart, mind, and soul, being a vet and too many other things. The question is, you got a Democratic commander-in-chief in the office, and he leans on the Republican Party. He does a good job. I'm well pleased with him. It's you people, you Democrats. I need you to support your president.
Well, I suppose I will answer. I suppose I'll answer the question the way any other member of Congress would, and some will be more accurate in their description than others. I support the president when I agree with him and I think he's right, and I do not support him when I don't. Being a Democrat, I find myself in agreement with the president most of the time, but on certain issues like this so-called trade agreement and fast track, I'm in very, very fundamental disagreement with the president. On national security, on this whole question of the USA Freedom Act, we wanted to go further than the administration wanted last year, but now they've caught up with us and they're supporting the USA Freedom Act, so we are in agreement.
So discussions on trade, since you brought it up, what's your main opposition to the president on these issues?
Well, I think that I don't know where to start. Number one, this is an agreement negotiated in secrecy. Now, I know the president has said that when Senator Warren says that it's not accurate, any member of Congress can go read it. Yes, I can go to a secure room and I can read parts of the agreement. I cannot take notes. I cannot take an aide with me unless it's security cleared. Most members do not have security cleared aides. And I can't, and I'm not even allowed, it's hard to talk about it. What good is that? An agreement ought to be negotiated so that people see the agreement. We'll have 90 days of fast-track passes to vote it up or down with no amendment. 1,000-page agreements, they may be fine for 900 of them, but 100 may be destructive. It's a violation of the sovereignty of the American people to do that. It's a violation of congressional prerogative, number one. Number two, these agreements that we've had, everyone since NAFTA has always had the same promises, all these trade agreements. We're going to increase trade, we're going to increase exports, it's going to be good for business. It's going to be good for the workers. In every single case, bar none, we have greatly increased our trade deficit, we've lost jobs, and it has desperately hurt the middle class and working people in this country. I see no reason to think this will be different. And if they really want to show why it'll be different, it should be public, we should see it. The so-called labor and environmental provisions have never been enforced. I see no reason to expect they'll be enforced now. And that goes by this administration, too. So I think that this agreement is likely to be very destructive of American jobs, is likely to increase pressure to offshore American jobs, is likely to increase downward pressure on wages. I think these trade agreements since NAFTA have been one of the major reasons why most of the money that's come in during economic expansions have gone to the top 1% and why the middle class is being shrunk. So if we could see the agreement, send it out for a few months to the economists, to the public schools, to the universities, get comments back, see where it makes sense, what doesn't, have an amendment process, then we could consider it. The way it is now, a secret negotiated process, a treaty agreement with only the major multinationals involved in it, no labor, no environmental, in secret, and then a 90-day up or down vote, and we won't even have time to properly examine it. No. 202-748-8000 for Democrats. For Republicans, 202-748-8001. And for Independents,
748-8002. Bill Daley, who was involved in the NAFTA process, has an op-ed in the New York Times today, and he particularly refers to Democrats, and this is in part what he says. He says, with much of the opposition coming from his own party, would tell the nation that Democrats has lost confidence in the economic leadership of the man who steered us out of near depression. In effect, Mr. Obama's own party would be stripping him of the same ability to negotiate trade agreements that every president since FDR, except for Richard M. Nixon, has enjoyed.
Well, first of all, modern, I don't know what he means by every president since FDR. Modern fast track was invented by Richard Nixon, so I don't know what before that. We refused to give it to President Clinton, I think, in 1997. We refused to extend it at that time. But the fact is, I do not trust the president on trade. Not this president, not the last few presidents. The trade process, the U.S. Trade Office, is dominated by the multinational corporations, and the results have been disastrous for the middle class, for working people. And I do not have confidence in this U.S. Trade Office, and I do not have confidence in a secret process, and I don't want to see the power that was enjoyed by previous presidents that they shouldn't have enjoyed extended or granted again. We should have a much more open process.
Let's hear from Zach in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Go ahead.
Hello, C-SPAN, and thank you for the congressman being on. I have a question. I live in Minneapolis, and there's a big Somalian population. There's always threats of terrorism. And it seems like the government creates the problem by allowing unlimited immigration from these countries that are a problem, and then want to spy on everyone else just to find out who the terrorist is. It seems like, why not just stop them from coming in the first place?
Well, we do not have unlimited immigration from any country, so I don't know what you're referring to. We have an asylum program, but which is very limited. It's limited in number and it's limited in process. If people can show, once they're here, you can't claim asylum from abroad, but once they're here, if they can show that they would be going to their deaths or to persecution to be sent back home for some reason, then they're eligible to apply for asylum. And terrorism, obviously you want to keep terrorists or potential terrorists out at the border if you can figure out who they are. You don't always know that, obviously. But terrorism can also be homegrown. You have to fight terrorism, whether here or abroad, but you have to do it in ways that don't destroy American liberties, and we think the USA Freedom Act is a reasonable compromise on that grounds. Now, there are improvements we should make beyond it. There's some criticism of the USA Freedom Act that doesn't go far enough, criticisms that I'd agree with. It doesn't deal, for instance, with Section 702, which is to say surveillance of foreigners abroad that comes back into this country because someone here talks to someone abroad, and you start then surveilling the person here. We ought to rein that in somewhat and control it. And the USA Freedom Act doesn't do that, but we'll get another chance to do that on some of the appropriations bills coming up next month.
Millway, New Jersey. Henry, you're next.
Yeah, good morning. It's Henry. Just have a quick question about the unemployment extension plan. They shut it down first time since '72. Now it got passed and it's bouncing around in the Senate. Now they told me when the Republicans got control, things might happen. I haven't heard anything in over a year on TV about it.
I don't know who told you that when the Republicans got control, things would happen. It's just the opposite. The Republicans were the ones who opposed extension of long-term unemployment benefits. For the first time ever during a recession or recovery from a recession, it wasn't extended. It's not we're not talking about it now because the Republicans control both houses, and I'm not accusing them, I'm simply stating a fact. They're upfront about it. They're opposed, and they shout from the heavens, they're opposed to extension of extended benefits on unemployment. They think that leads to more unemployment. I think that's ridiculous, but that's their position, and as long as they're in control, we're not going to have it.
Fayetteville, North Carolina. Grady up next. Hello.
Hello?
You're on. Go ahead.
Okay, I have a question. I have a question about the. This is Grady. I have a question about the trade agreement.
Go ahead.
On this trade, what happens if we don't sign the trade agreement? By not signing the trade agreement, how many jobs are going to be made?
Well, I don't think it's a question of how many jobs are going to be made by not signing a trade agreement. It's a question of how many jobs will be lost if we do sign the trade agreement. And I don't have a figure off the top of my head, but history tells us from the last few trade agreements that it will be very large numbers of jobs that will be lost as it becomes easier for American multinationals to offshore jobs to countries that pay 30 cents an hour, like Vietnam or some other countries. So we'll lose a lot of jobs. How many, I couldn't tell you. One other problem I forgot to mention before, but it's a major problem with the trade agreement, is the Investor Dispute Resolution System, the ISDS. And what this says, and it's in some of our previous trade agreements, but it's becoming used more and more, is that any foreign company, not an American company, but any foreign company that objects to any American regulation or law, Buy American, labels cigarettes as dangerous to the public health, you name it, whether it's a federal law or state law or a local law, can object to that law and say that, gee, and sue the country or the state or the city or the county for that matter, and sue them and say, because of that law or regulation, we are losing profits. Pay us the difference between what we are making now and what we would have made except for your environmental or safety law or whatever. And this does not go to the American courts. This case goes to a private corporate tribunal from which there is no appeal. So you have corporate lawyers representing corporations sitting in a private tribunal saying to the United States Congress or the state legislature, the city council, you cannot enforce your law, and if you try to do, it will cost you hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. Right now, under a similar provision, Australia is being sued by an American tobacco company saying we're losing profits because you're insisting on having labeling on the cigarette package that says cigarettes will kill you or something. And this can endanger, certainly by American provisions, it could endanger environmental provisions, it can endanger worker safety or health provisions, almost any law we have. And we would be ceding to corporations instead of to the democratic process of the American people.
Representative Jerrold Nadler, our guest, Democrat from New York, serves on the Judiciary Committee, also serves on the Transportation Infrastructure Committee member. He is with us to talk to you. 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, and 202-748-8002 for Independents. From Edmond, Oklahoma, David, good morning.
Hey, good morning, gentlemen. I think it's ironic that we're carrying on this discussion when this very weekend we're going to be decorating the graves of millions of Americans who sacrificed everything for this country. And it seems to me that what I'm being asked to sacrifice is that somewhere there may be a recording of the lemon chicken recipe that my mother gave me over the phone. And that doesn't seem like much of a sacrifice for me to make in comparison. And therein lies what I believe is a fundamental flaw in your philosophy, Congressman, and that is that this nation or any nation can exist without some sacrifice on the part of its 230 million human component. And that simply defies credulity. And I simply do not agree with you.
Well, first of all, we have 330 million, almost not 230 million people these days. But second of all, no one says that we can exist or should exist without any sacrifice. Our soldiers, our sailors, our air people make plenty of sacrifices, our police officers. We all make sacrifices. We pay taxes, half of which goes for defense and so forth. But the fact is, we want to maintain liberty. That's why this country was created, to maintain liberty and freedom and freedom of equality and liberty, basically. One of the reasons we rebelled against the British was because they used to issue what were called writs of assistance or general warrants, in which the king's officer could come in and say, give me anything I want to see, show me anything. You had no privacy. The Fourth Amendment was written in 1791 to say you can't do that. If you want to see something or search something, you have to describe particularly what you want to search or seize, and you have to show a court some probable cause or at least reasonable suspicion to believe that that is related to a crime and why you have a legitimate reason to see that. All we're trying to do is to restore what we have always said in this country, namely that you can't have general invasions of privacy. You have to have some reason, some good reason that a court will agree with why the government needs that information. And that information, as I said before, the so-called metadata, can be very, very revealing of all kinds of things about individuals, which frankly is none of the government's business to know unless that person is suspected reasonably of committing a crime or being or participating in a terrorist network or something. We have to balance our liberty and our security, and we can. And exactly where you place that balance is what we've been debating.
Here's Chicago, Illinois. Carlos, hello.
Good morning. How you doing?
Good morning.
First of all, I'd like to make a comment, and then I have maybe two questions. Mr. Nadler, I do agree with you because I am that type of person too. That yes, sir, I support our president, and I don't support everything that he all his policies, but I support most of them. Okay, such as I'll give an example, such as like even when broadcast, it was made that every household had to get a cable box or cable just to even watch C-SPAN, this, that, and the other and everything. Now this became mandatory to where all households did have freedom of just to even watch TV. So then when he came into office, and then I didn't support that. But we was talking about like the NSA surveillance programs. As I'm watching that, and then if I'm on the phone, and I have studied Islam, so now if I say the word Allah, now that'll set off a certain trigger within the surveillance programs. Now my freedom is taken away from me, to whereas as an American, I was told that I have the freedom of speech. So whoever I'm talking to.
I'm not sure what the question is, but I certainly agree that government's powers of surveillance and observation have to be limited. What the gentleman just referred to, if someone mentioning the word Allah on a telephone call sets off an algorithm in some computer that brings suspicion on you and says, let's look at your phone calls more, that's a violation not only of your privacy, but of freedom of religion. And this is the kind of thing we don't want, obviously. And let me just say also, I'm gratified to hear you say you usually support. I think he's been a very good president on most things, but and now on the surveillance, he agrees with, or I agree with him. He agrees with us now. The one major disagreement that I have at the moment with the president is the trade.
Arkansas, George is up next. Hello.
Good morning.
Morning. Go ahead.
If Obama wishes to keep his campaign program promise that he would renegotiate NAFTA, I would be fine with that, and then we can look at TPP. That's my comment, and I'll take it off there. Thank you.
Well, I wish we would renegotiate NAFTA for the better. I think the administration would say that TPP is the renegotiation of NAFTA, but from my point of view, it's for the worse.
From Sherman Oaks, California, here is Joseph for our guest representative, Jerrold Nadler. Hello.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
It's about crime in America. Very simple. I've been here 66 years from France after World War II, and it's a problem the government has created and self-inflicted itself. Imports have eliminated all the jobs we don't have. 100 million people can't find work. Somebody rid of all of them. I've never even held a gun in my hand, except the old cowboy movies I've seen. And so you need to stop importing, restructure the whole economy,
we can't.
Manufacturing base, a job for everybody, and get rid of everybody's gun, including the cops. We don't need them with of everybody.
We'll let guest respond. Go ahead.
Well, you can't, nor should you, stop all importing. Imports are very are important to this country. The problem, and exports too, obviously. The problem with the trade agreements that we've had is that, contrary to the promises made when they were being debated, yes, they increased our exports, but they also increased our imports by a much greater factor. So that before NAFTA, for example, we had, I forget whether we had a surplus, a trade surplus with Mexico or a very small trade deficit. Now we have a large trade deficit with Mexico. We have huge trade deficits And when the president or other people supporting these trade agreements says, well, every $1 billion of exports means I forget how many thousands of jobs. Okay, but every $1 billion of imports means a loss of the same number of jobs. And our trade deficits, which is to say the excess of our imports over our exports, have ballooned after every one of these trade agreements, and would again, I think, under the TPP. So that's one of the problems, and that's why we oppose this kind of agreement. Now, you could easily envision trade agreements that would be to the benefit of this country. But when you have a 1,000-page agreement, it's not free trade. A free trade agreement would be 10 pages long, a list of all the commodities and the date when the tariffs went to zero. That's a free trade agreement. These agreements, 1,000 pages, 5,000 pages, are very carefully negotiated in a multiple of subjects, and they haven't been balanced. And this one, from what we know of it, is highly imbalanced to the detriment of our working people, and that's why we have to oppose it.
Richard lives in Washington, D.C., independent line. Go ahead.
Congressman Nadler, I've heard you called the brightest member of Congress, and by and large, you've justified it this morning. And I just want to ask if you believe that Congress really is a co-equal policy-making body, including foreign policy, with the executive branch. You can, I believe, for example, in the trade agreements, say that the nations that want to discriminate against Israel through boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, the so-called BDS, have to desist from such maneuvers before they get free trade with America, full free trade with America. And also, for example, there are always criticisms about the president's foreign policy and Middle East policy, but can't you, in response to the authorization for use of military force, set down the conditions that should be there for the president's intervention? For example, the rules that have been called the rules that we learned from Vietnam and other missteps, and which were pretty much followed in the first Gulf War, but lay those out as guidelines to the president so that when he uses military force, we know what's going to happen and we have an exit strategy, for example. And with respect to Iran, why can't you lay down the markers that Iran is a perpetrator of terrorism? They abuse their people just as ISIS does. They are trying to control at least 4 nations and more in the Middle East and beyond and so forth. Why can't we refer to those things? And they're threatening genocide against Israel. Can't we refer to those things in the Iran legislation? And I'll listen to your response.
Thanks, caller.
Well, there are about a half a dozen questions there. I'm not sure where to start or if I remember all the questions, but Congress is a co-equal branch of government if it will assert itself. And one of the limits on congressional power is, can it get the votes in a particular direction in both houses? I do believe that ever since World War II, presidents have to a large extent ridden roughshod over Congress, and Congress has ceded too much power to presidents since World War II in terms of getting us into wars. And I think, whether you're talking about President Reagan invading Grenada without congressional authorization, or President Obama going into Libya without congressional authorization, and a dozen others, I think they were all unconstitutional actions, but in none of those places was Congress able to, or perhaps willing to, oppose it. It's also easy for Congress to let hard decisions be made by the president, and criticize it afterwards if it doesn't work out, and not criticize it if things work fine. But that doesn't help congressional power, and it doesn't help democratic government. Let me talk for a moment about Iran. You raised some real questions. Iran is a major threat to the United States, to Israel, to other Middle Eastern countries in many different ways. And the worst thing that could happen would be for Iran to get a nuclear weapon. That would be intolerable for a lot of reasons. It would lead to a nuclear arms race in a very unstable region. Iran cannot be trusted not to use them, or even perhaps not to give them to a terrorist organization. So Iran cannot be allowed to have nuclear weapons. So one question is how to stop them. Now, we're working out an agreement, and until we see the details of that agreement's verification and enforcement provisions and inspection provisions, I, for one, won't be able to say whether it's an adequate agreement or not. But assuming that the inspection and enforcement and verification is adequate, then it would probably be the best alternative of the three alternatives to avoid their having a nuclear weapon. There are three alternatives. One is an agreement. Two, what I call the tough guy alternative, what the Republicans want, Senator Menendez, Prime Minister Netanyahu, walk away from the agreement because it's not good enough, go to harsh sanctions. The problem with that, and then you'll get a better deal. The problem with that is twofold. Number one, if we walk away from an agreement that the Europeans think, and the Russians and Chinese think, is a reasonable agreement, they won't join in sanctions with us. We'll have weak sanctions. And the S-300 missile deal that Russia made with Iran recently is a tip-off to that. They're looking for an excuse not to go along with sanctions. If the Iranians walk away, then you might have harsh sanctions. But second of all, when you have when you apply sanctions, weak sanctions without the Europeans and the Russians and Chinese, hard sanctions with them, you're making a bet. The bet you're making is that the sanctions you've imposed, combined with the low price of oil, brings about the economic collapse of the regime, or so close to it that they cry uncle before they get a nuclear bomb in a year and a half or two. I don't think that's a very good bet. I think if you go down that road, they probably end up with a nuclear weapon. The third alternative is war, which is not something we want to see, obviously. Which means if you can get an agreement that's enforceable, that will keep them from getting a weapon, that's the best way. But the key is, can you get an agreement that's enforceable? And we won't know that till we see the terms. Now, the last question you asked, one of the most important, is that a lot of people are trying to put conditions that we would love to see on this agreement. You can't have this agreement unless Iran recognizes Israel, or stops threatening to destroy it, or stops sponsoring terrorism, or other things. The problem with that is that if you put those conditions on, you won't get an agreement, and they will probably get a nuclear bomb. All of those things are major problems. We have to oppose them. We have to oppose the Iranians in other ways. This deal, if it comes to fruition, is for one purpose only, and that is to prevent them from getting a nuclear bomb. We're still going to have to oppose their terrorism. We're still going to have to oppose their malevolent genocidal intent against Israel. We're still going to have to oppose their hegemonic activities in the Middle East. But all of which would be made much, much worse if they had a nuclear bomb. This agreement, if it comes to fruition, can deal with at least one of those problems. If you try to put too many of those problems on it, then you won't get anywhere, and you'll be saddled with a nuclear-armed Iran, which will make all of those threats much worse.
We're almost out of time, but quick responses to two questions. The Highway Transportation Fund, do you see a deadline? What will happen because of the deadline? Do you think a deal will be reached?
Probably, without my vote. They will extend it just 2 months because we can get away with extending it 2 months. The Highway Trust Fund won't go. There's still money for 2 months, but that's it. We've been kicking this down the road, I think, 32 times so far, and we're just about at the end. We're spending about $50 billion a year, roughly, on transportation. We should be spending about $80 billion a year to start catching up on the several $trillion backlog to get our roads and highways and bridges and mass transit systems and Amtrak up to a safe and reasonable condition. The gasoline tax is a wasting asset. We last raised the gasoline tax in 1993. It's inflating away. Every year it's worth less in terms of purchasing power because it's not inflation sensitive. And we keep saying, for public policy, we want to be more energy efficient, have higher mileage per gasoline, use less gasoline. That's succeeding, but that means less tax revenue. We have to either raise the gasoline tax or bring in another revenue source, or both, because the system cannot exist at the level it's at now. We are spending now about 1.7% on infrastructure. The Europeans are spending about 4 to 5%, the Chinese 9%. We used to spend about 4.5%, pre-Reagan actually, at 4.5%. If we're spending 1.7% in infrastructure, the Chinese 9%, the Europeans 5%, that means our economy is going to get less and less competitive over the years because you need efficient highways, you need efficient transportation, you need efficient broadband, you need efficient basic infrastructure basis for your economy to compete. If we can't compete, we're going to lose jobs, we're going to lose economic strength, we're going to lose wages are going to go down, everything. We have to maintain the basic infrastructure of this country, which we did for 200 years. We were the pioneers, but we have to get back to that.
One more question real quick. Amtrak, what's the best way forward?
We have to start funding Amtrak reasonably. Remember, Amtrak became a public corporation because the freight railroads wanted to abandon passenger service. We didn't want them to abandon passenger service, so we nationalized it, but you got to fund it at a reasonable level. We're spending less than 2% of our transportation budget on rail, 98% on highways, about 80% on mass transit, about 80% on highways, about 15% on mass transit, 2% on rail. That's just inadequate.
Representative Jerrold Nadler of New York, the Judiciary Committee member, also the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee member. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Our next guest is from the Washington Post. Jim Tankersley joins us about a story he wrote taking a look at droughts in the West. Nothing new, but looks at the potential economic damage that could be done to the economy if a long-term lack of rain takes place. He'll join us next as Washington Journal continues.